The lawyer set the folder down on the long walnut table, and the sound it made was louder than any of them expected, because for the first time in 10 years, every single person in that family was staring at the same man, and none of them could look him in the eye. "Before we begin," the lawyer said, "Daniel asked me to remind you of something. He said you would understand once you saw the numbers." Daniel Reyes sat at the head of the table, hands folded, wearing a plain gray suit that looked expensive only if you knew what to look for, and he watched his mother's fingers tremble around her coffee cup, watched his brother Marcus loosen his tie, like the room had suddenly gotten hot, watched his sister Claire glance at the folder like it might bite her. 10 years earlier, this same family had sat around a different table at a different house and decided, calmly, over turkey and mashed potatoes, that Daniel would not be getting a cent of the family business, that the money and the trust and the name would go to Marcus, because Marcus was, in his father's words, the one who actually stayed. Nobody in that dining room 10 years ago knew that the quiet, overlooked son sitting at the far end of the table, the one who left college early to take a warehouse job nobody respected, would one day walk back into their lives holding the exact same real estate portfolio his father had spent 40 years building. Except this time, he wouldn't be asking for a seat at the table. He would own the table. The lawyer, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Patricia Vance, cleared her throat and began reading from the folder, and every word she said seemed to land differently on each face at that table, the way the same news can feel like a verdict to one person and a lifeline to another. Eleanor Reyes, 71 years old now, kept glancing at her son like she was trying to memorize a face she'd let herself forget for a decade. Marcus kept his jaw tight, the way he used to when he was a teenager, and got caught in a lie he thought was clever enough to survive scrutiny. Claire had her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. And Daniel just listened, the way he'd trained himself to listen for years in boardrooms, full of people who underestimated him. Quiet, patient, absorbing every word without giving anything away. Nobody in that room that morning could have guessed that the calm, composed man at the head of the table had once been the boy nobody bothered calling on his birthday, the son whose absence from family photographs had become so normal that at some point nobody even remarked on it anymore. To understand how that forgotten son ended up controlling the very inheritance he'd been cut out of, you have to go back more than a decade, to a Sunday afternoon in a small Ohio suburb, back when Daniel Reyes was 22 years old and still believed, in the stubborn, hopeful way young people believe things they desperately need to be true, that hard work and loyalty were things families noticed. His father, Walter Reyes, had built Reyes Properties from a single duplex into a modest but respected chain of rental buildings across 3 counties, the kind of business that made the local paper twice a year and made Walter feel, in his own mind, like a self-made king. Walter was the sort of man who measured love in usefulness and measured usefulness in visibility. If he couldn't see you working, in his mind you weren't really working at all. Walter had 2 sons and a daughter, and like a lot of fathers of his generation, he never seemed to notice he'd built an entirely different relationship with each of them. Marcus, the eldest, was sharp-tongued, confident, and good at making Walter laugh, which mattered more in that house than almost anything else. He had a way of turning even his failures into stories that made him look clever, and Walter, who had never been especially introspective, mistook charisma for competence more times than he probably ever admitted to himself. Claire, the youngest, was Walter's favorite in the quiet, uncomplicated way daughters often are with fathers who never learned how to express affection directly. She got the soft voice reserved for someone fragile, the patient smile, the benefit of every doubt, and she learned early that staying agreeable was easier than pushing back. And then there was Daniel, the middle child, wedged in that particular kind of birth order silence where you're too old to be coddled and too young to be respected, the one who did the work nobody asked him to do and rarely got thanked for it. He was the one who fixed the leaking pipes at the 5th Street building at 11 at night because a tenant called crying and nobody else answered the phone. The one who quietly balanced the books when the bookkeeper quit without notice, teaching himself basic accounting from library books he checked out under a fake sense of urgency, just so the business wouldn't miss a single payroll cycle. He never told anyone he'd done it. He just did it, and waited in the aching, hopeful way children wait for parents who never quite give them what they need, believing that eventually, someday, if he just proved himself enough times, his father would finally notice. The moment that changed everything happened without any warning at all, which is usually how the moments that change everything tend to happen. Walter had a mild stroke at 61, nothing that left him paralyzed, but enough to scare him into thinking seriously, for the first time, about what would happen to the business when he was gone. Instead of calling a family meeting to talk it through honestly, the way a business built on family should probably be discussed. Walter did what a lot of proud, aging men do. He made a decision quietly, alone, based on old assumptions he never once bothered to question, and he let his lawyer draft the paperwork before he told a single member of his family. When he finally gathered everyone at that Thanksgiving table, the smell of turkey and cinnamon still thick in the air, the table still cluttered with half-finished plates, he announced, almost cheerfully, like he was handing out gifts instead of dividing a life's work, that Marcus would take over as president of Reyes Properties, that Claire would receive a trust fund to finish her design degree without worry, and that Daniel, who had spent 6 years quietly holding the business together, including the very months of his father's stroke recovery that had apparently prompted this decision, would receive, as Walter put it, a fair severance, which turned out to be $8,000 and a handshake, delivered with the same tone a man might use to thank a contractor for a job well done. The room went quiet in that specific, ringing way. Rooms go quiet when everyone feels something wrong has just happened and nobody wants to be the first to say it. Daniel set his fork down slowly. Severance, he repeated, like he was testing whether the word actually meant what he thought it meant. Dad, I've been running half the books for 6 years. I found the leak in the Maple Street roof before it cost you 30 grand in water damage. I renegotiated 2 of the vendor contracts myself. Walter didn't even look up from his plate when he answered. You did good work, son. Nobody's saying you didn't. But Marcus is the one who stayed close. He's here for the holidays. He's here when I need someone at my side. You always seemed like you had 1 foot out the door. It wasn't cruelty exactly, not the kind that comes with raised voices, which somehow made it worse. It was the calm, absent-minded cruelty of a man who had already made his decision weeks earlier and was only now getting around to informing the people it affected. Nobody at that table defended Daniel. His mother stared at her plate, rearranging peas she had no intention of eating. Claire mouthed a silent, "I'm sorry," across the table and did nothing else, her eyes darting quickly back to her father, like she was afraid of catching his disapproval by association. Marcus, to his credit or perhaps to his shame, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, though not uncomfortable enough to say a word in his brother's defense. Daniel sat there for a long moment, feeling something inside him go very quiet and very still, a kind of stillness he would later recognize as the exact moment hope finally runs out of road, and then he did something none of them expected. He picked his fork back up, said, "Okay," in a voice so level it unsettled his mother more than shouting would have, and finished his dinner like nothing had happened at all. What none of them understood, not then and not for years afterward, was that Daniel's calm wasn't defeat. It was the exact moment he stopped performing for an audience that was never going to applaud. Within 3 months, Daniel had moved 2 states away, taken a warehouse logistics job that paid barely enough to cover rent, and told his family almost nothing about his life. His mother called occasionally, mostly out of guilt, and the calls got shorter every year until they became birthday texts, then just missed calls, then nothing at all. Marcus never called. Claire sent a Christmas card the first year, and then quietly let that habit die too, the way people do when guilt becomes inconvenient. For 10 years, the Reyes family built a comfortable narrative around Daniel's absence. He was doing his own thing, he needed space, he was always a little distant anyway. The kind of soft lies families tell themselves so they don't have to sit with the harder truth, which is that they simply stopped trying. What they never bothered to ask, not once in a decade, was what Daniel was actually doing with his life, because the truth would have terrified them. While they assumed he was drifting, Daniel was building something with a discipline that bordered on obsession, driven by a quiet, controlled anger he never let anyone see. The warehouse job lasted 18 months, long enough for Daniel to save just enough money to enroll in night classes for real estate finance, studying until 2 in the morning after 10-hour shifts, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night for the better part of 2 years, surviving on gas station coffee, and a stubbornness that felt at the time like the only thing he had left that was fully his own. He got his real estate license at 24, and instead of chasing quick commissions on suburban homes like every other new agent scrambling to make rent, he specialized in something almost nobody else wanted to touch: distressed commercial properties in declining Midwest towns that bigger investors had already written off as dead money. Daniel had learned something at his father's company that his father himself had apparently forgotten in the comfort of success. Patience was the only real advantage a small player had against bigger money, and nobody with real capital had the patience to wait on a half-dead strip mall in a town most people were leaving. He'd buy those properties for pennies on the dollar, personally sit down with the 2 or 3 tenants still hanging on, listen to what they actually needed instead of what a spreadsheet said they should pay, slowly bring in new businesses by offering fairer terms than anyone else in the market was willing to give. And within 3 or 4 years, the property would be worth 4 or 5 times what he'd paid for it. He did this quietly, methodically, reinvesting almost everything he made instead of spending it, living in a one-bedroom apartment that hadn't meaningfully changed since he was 26, driving a car with 200,000 miles on it, long past the point his mechanic started giving him worried looks, because Daniel understood something most people never learn until it's too late, that looking rich and actually being secure are almost always opposite goals. And he had decided, somewhere around his 25th birthday, spent alone in that apartment with a bag of takeout and a stack of property listings, that he would rather be quietly secure than visibly successful. Along the way, there were setbacks nobody ever heard about either. A property in Indiana that flooded twice in 1 year and nearly wiped out 8 months of savings. A business partner in his late 20s who tried to quietly siphon rental income before Daniel caught the discrepancy in a routine audit and ended the partnership within a week, cold and clean, no shouting, just documents and a locksmith. Every setback taught him the same lesson twice. Trust had to be earned in numbers, not promises, and Daniel got very good very fast at reading numbers. By the time he was 30, Daniel Reyes quietly controlled a portfolio of 11 properties across 4 states, worth just over $6 million, and not a single member of his family knew any of it because he had made absolutely certain of that. He operated everything through a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone who might go looking. Cormorant Ridge Holdings, and he never once posted about his life online, never gave interviews to the small regional business journals that occasionally asked, never let his success become visible to the very people who, he suspected, would only ever see it as either something to resent or something to ask for. The twist that set everything in motion, the one nobody could have predicted, arrived in the form of a phone call Daniel almost didn't answer, from a number he didn't recognize, from a woman named Patricia Vance, who identified herself as an attorney representing his father's estate. Walter Reyes had died of a second stroke, sudden and final, 3 weeks earlier, and here was the detail that made Daniel's stomach drop even through 10 years of practiced detachment. Nobody in his family had called to tell him. He found out about his own father's death from a stranger's voice on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of reviewing a lease agreement. And for a moment, the quiet, controlled man who had spent a decade building an empire out of spite and discipline had to sit down on the floor of his office because his legs simply stopped working. Patricia explained that Walter's will named Marcus as sole heir to Reyes properties, as expected, but there was a complication. Under Ohio law, and because of a clause Walter himself had apparently added years earlier without fully understanding its consequences, any child excluded from an estate had the right to formally contest the will within a set window. And Patricia, who had apparently known Walter for years and had her own private opinions about how Daniel had been treated, felt it was her professional obligation to inform him of that right. Daniel almost said no. Almost told her he wanted nothing to do with any of it, that he'd built his own life and didn't need his father's approval or his father's money, even in death. But then Patricia mentioned something that changed his mind entirely. Reyes Properties, under Marcus's leadership for the past 2 years since Walter's health had declined, was nearly $400,000 in debt, was 3 payments behind on a commercial loan secured against every building the family owned, and was, by Patricia's professional estimate, roughly 90 days from total foreclosure. Daniel flew back to Ohio not for revenge, not yet, but because some old, stubborn part of him still couldn't stand the idea of watching his father's life's work collapse. Even after everything, even after 10 years of silence, he had never once broken first. What he found when he arrived told him almost everything he needed to know about the decade he'd missed. Marcus had run the company the way he'd run everything else in his life, confidently, carelessly, always assuming someone else would eventually clean up whatever mess he left behind. He'd taken out loans against the properties to fund a lifestyle that photographed beautifully online, vacations and a new truck and a lake house he could barely afford the taxes on, but had no real income behind any of it because the rental revenue that should have covered those loans was instead being quietly drained by mismanagement. He'd fired the experienced property managers Walter had trusted for decades, people who'd known every building down to its bones, and replaced them with friends who had no real experience and even less accountability. And he'd ignored maintenance issues for so long that 3 of the 11 original Reyes buildings were now facing serious code violations, the kind that could trigger city fines or forced closures if left unaddressed much longer. Claire, Daniel learned through the financial records he began quietly, legally, methodically requesting the moment he filed as a contesting heir, had married into money years earlier and mostly stayed out of the day-to-day business. Though she'd somehow still collected a consulting fee from the company for 2 full years despite never once, according to any meeting minutes or project files Daniel could find, actually consulting on anything. His mother, Eleanor, was still living in the same house on Birchwood Lane, older and smaller than he remembered, the porch light flickering the same way it had flickered when he was a teenager, and nobody had ever fixed it. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, she went completely silent for a moment. One hand pressed against the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright, and then she started crying before she managed to say a single word. Daniel felt the old ache rise up fast in his chest, sudden and unwelcome, before he forced it back down into the same quiet place he'd learned to keep it for 10 years. Because he had learned the hard way that his mother's tears had never once, in his entire childhood, translated into her actually standing thing up for him when it mattered. Daniel spent his first week back, sitting with his mother in that quiet house, not talking about the will or the business at all, just listening as she told him, in careful, roundabout ways, how the last decade had actually gone. She admitted, without quite framing it as an admission, that Walter had gotten harder to live with after the stroke, more controlling, more prone to snapping at small mistakes, and that she'd spent years quietly managing his moods rather than questioning his decisions, a habit she'd built over 4 decades of marriage and never quite learned how to break. She admitted that she'd wanted to call Daniel more times than she could count, that she'd sometimes sat with the phone in her hand for 10-15 minutes at a time before finally setting it down, telling herself he was probably busy, telling herself it would be easier next week, next month, next year, until the years had simply piled up into a silence too large to know how to break. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the first honest thing Daniel had heard from her in a decade, and he filed it away the same way he filed everything else important, carefully, without reacting, without letting anyone see exactly how much it cost him to hear it. Then he got to work. The confrontation everyone expected, the shouting match, the dramatic reveal, the storming out, never came, because Daniel had learned something in 10 years of building his own empire that his family had never fully learned in 40. Real power doesn't announce itself, it documents itself. Instead of arguing with Marcus about fairness or old wounds, Daniel spent 6 quiet weeks doing what he did best. He worked with Patricia to formally contest the will, not out of greed, but because Ohio law made clear that Walter's estate plan had failed to account for a legally binding provision in an old partnership agreement Walter had signed with his own father decades earlier. A technical detail so obscure that even Marcus's lawyer hadn't caught it, which entitled any child who had contributed unpaid labor to the founding of the business, which Daniel very much had, and could prove with a decade of preserved emails, timesheets, and bookkeeping he'd secretly kept copies of even after he left, to a formal ownership stake regardless of the will's stated wishes. At the same time, quietly, through Cormorant Ridge Holdings, Daniel began buying up the very commercial debt that Marcus's mismanagement had accumulated, purchasing the distressed loan from the bank at a discount before Marcus even realized the loan had changed hands, which meant that by the time the family finally sat down at that lawyer's table with the folder on it, Daniel wasn't just a forgotten son asking for recognition. He was legally the single largest creditor of his own family's company, and he held the paper that determined whether Reyes Properties survived the next 90 days or collapsed into foreclosure. He spent those 6 weeks moving carefully, the way a good surgeon moves, never cutting more than necessary, never taking a step he couldn't undo if he needed to. He met with the bank that held the $400,000 loan against the Reyes properties, and using Cormorant Ridge Holdings, made a discreet offer to purchase the debt outright, an offer the bank accepted within days because a struggling regional bank facing its own liquidity pressures was more than happy to offload a shaky loan to a buyer with clean credit and a strong balance sheet. Nobody at the bank asked why a man named Daniel Reyes wanted to buy debt secured against a company called Reyes Properties, and if they'd looked closely enough to wonder, Daniel's lawyers had already made sure the paperwork gave them no obvious reason to. He worked with Patricia late into the evenings, going through decade-old partnership agreements line by line until they found the clause Walter himself had likely forgotten existed, a provision from when Walter had first inherited a stake in the business from his own father, stating that any child who contributed unpaid labor toward the founding or continued operation of the business retained a claim to formal equity regardless of what a later will specified. It was the kind of clause that existed in 1,000 old family business documents and almost never mattered because almost nobody ever thought to check for it, let alone had 10 years of preserved timesheets, emails, and bookkeeping records to prove they qualified. Daniel had kept every one of those records, not because he'd planned this exact moment a decade earlier, but because some quiet, wounded part of him had never quite believed the story his family told about him, and had wanted, even then, some kind of proof that he existed and that his work had mattered. The meeting where everything came apart, and then quietly, methodically, came back together, started the way most reckonings do, with everyone assuming they still had the upper hand. Marcus opened by trying old tactics, the same charm and dismissiveness that had worked on their father for 30 years, saying things like, "Daniel, we all know you've been gone a long time. I'm not sure you fully understand what's going on with the business." And Daniel let him talk, let him fill the silence with his own overconfidence, because Daniel had learned patience the hard way, and he wasn't about to waste it now. When Marcus finally finished, Daniel opened the folder himself, laid out the documents one at a time without raising his voice even slightly, and explained calmly that he wasn't contesting the will out of bitterness. He was contesting it because the law entitled him to, because he had the paperwork to prove 10 years of unpaid work nobody had ever acknowledged, and because, as of 6 days earlier, he now personally owned the $400,000 debt that stood between Reyes Properties and total collapse. Marcus's face went through several colors. Eleanor put a hand over her mouth. Claire, to her credit, was the first one to actually ask the right question, quiet and shaken. "Daniel, what do you want?" And Daniel, who had rehearsed exactly nothing, because he'd learned that rehearsed lines always sound rehearsed, said something that surprised even himself. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want the truth on the table, and then I want you all to actually choose me, for once, instead of just assuming you already know who I am." What followed over the next several weeks wasn't a hostile takeover, though Daniel absolutely could have taken the entire company out from under Marcus, and would have been legally justified in doing so. Instead, using the leverage he now held, Daniel restructured the debt himself, personally forgiving a portion of it in exchange for a formal, legally binding restructuring of the ownership, 30% for himself, reflecting his contested inheritance claim and his years of unpaid labor, and the remainder split between Marcus, Claire, and their mother, with the crucial condition that Marcus step down as president and Daniel take over operational control, not out of spite, but because Daniel was, quite simply, the only person in the family who had actually proven he knew how to run something profitably. Marcus resisted for exactly 1 week, calling lawyers of his own, floating threats about fighting the restructuring in court, the same old bravado Daniel remembered from childhood arguments over nothing, until Patricia gently reminded him that his other realistic option was personal bankruptcy and the very public foreclosure of a business that still carried his father's name on every sign, every lease, every piece of stationery. Something in Marcus finally broke that week in a way that looked less like defeat and more like relief, the exhausted relief of a man who had been drowning quietly for 2 years behind a confident smile and had simply run out of energy to keep pretending otherwise. In private, weeks later, over coffee neither of them really wanted at a diner neither of them would have chosen 10 years earlier, Marcus admitted something to Daniel that neither of them had ever said out loud in their entire lives. "I always knew, somewhere," Marcus said, turning his mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. That dad picked me because I was easier. Easier to praise, easier to laugh with, harder to disappoint, because he never expected much from me in the first place. You, he actually expected things from, and I think that scared him more than it should have. He admitted that running a company he never fully understood, propped up by a confidence he didn't actually feel, had been the loneliest decade of his life. Lonelier, he said, than he imagined Daniel's 10 years of silence had been, which was, Daniel realized, probably the closest thing to an apology Marcus knew how to give. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, not fully, but it was the first honest sentence either brother had said to the other in a decade. And for two men who had built their entire relationship on comfortable silence and performed confidence, that single honest sentence felt like its own kind of miracle. The moment that closed the story, the one that gave the whole decade its final shape, came almost a year later, at a small gathering nobody had expected to happen at all. A modest dinner, not at the old family house on Birchwood Lane, but at a restaurant Daniel chose himself, downtown, with big windows and warm light, to mark the first genuinely profitable quarter Reyes properties had posted in 3 years under his leadership. It wasn't a grand celebration. There were no toasts, no speeches, just 4 people who had spent a decade barely speaking, sitting around a table that finally felt less like a battlefield and more like what a family table was supposed to feel like. Eleanor came dressed carefully, quieter and more thoughtful with her words than Daniel remembered from his childhood. And at one point during dinner, without any prompting, without the conversation building toward it, in any obvious way, she simply reached over and took his hand across the table. I should have said something 10 years ago at that table, she said, her voice steady in a way that told Daniel she'd rehearsed this sentence privately more than once. I've thought about it almost every day since. I'm sorry it took me this long to actually say it out loud instead of just thinking it. Daniel didn't cry, not there, not in front of everyone, because he had spent too many years learning to keep his face still in rooms like this. But something in his chest that had been clenched tight for a decade finally quietly let go, the way a fist relaxes after holding something too long without realizing it. Claire, who had by then used her design background to help modernize 3 of the company's oldest properties, finally admitted, somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, that she'd spent years telling herself Daniel's absence was entirely his own choice, a comfortable lie that let her avoid the much harder truth, that she'd simply never once tried, not really, to close the distance herself, never sent more than a card, never made a call that wasn't easy to forget. And Marcus, in the strange, humbled way people change once they finally stop performing a confidence they never actually felt, had become, unexpectedly, someone Daniel could genuinely talk to. Not because Marcus had transformed overnight into a different man, but because for the first time in his adult life, he was finally being honest about who he actually was, flaws included. Instead of continuing to perform the version of himself he thought their father had always wanted. Daniel never got a dramatic apology from his father, because his father was gone, and some wounds simply don't get the closure people want in stories. They get closure in the quieter, harder work of building something better out of what's left. But standing at the head of that table a year later, watching his mother laugh for the first time in longer than he could remember, watching Marcus and Claire actually listen when he spoke instead of talking over him, Daniel understood something that no amount of money could have taught him faster. The family hadn't forgotten him because he wasn't worth remembering. They'd forgotten him because it was easier than reckoning with their own choices, and the only way to make people who've stopped seeing you finally look is to stop shrinking yourself down to fit inside their old assumptions. He hadn't vanished with millions to punish them, not really, even if that's the version people who heard the story later liked to tell. He'd vanished because staying would have meant slowly disappearing in a much quieter, much sadder way, the way people disappear when they spend years waiting for a family to notice them that has already quietly decided not to. And he came back not for revenge, but because 10 years of discipline had finally given him something his family never gave him on their own. The simple, unshakable proof that he had always been worth the table they never saved a seat for.